We start now. So, am I audible now?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. It's pleasure to introduce two very young scholars to our book discussion at the Association of Indian Research Scholars. Let me first briefly introduce AIRS to those who are not aware about the platform. AIRS is an association of young research scholars from across the universities in India, and we have been active since September 2020 and have successfully hosted many eminent scholars, including Noam Chomsky, Professor Joseph Nye, Rajen Harsey, Joya Hassan, among many others, on a range of issues, topics, and we have also organized three book discussions before this, and this is the fourth book discussion that we are having. And apart from that, we have also released two newsletters, including webinar reports and opinion pieces by young scholars from India. So if anyone who wants to contribute to opinion pieces to the newsletter, they are welcome to contact the people at the people through the social media or email address given at the website. And so let me introduce today's uh, speaker, Dr. Okay, Mohamed Zeeshan, who will be discussing his new book published in 2020 and 21, sorry, in January 2021. He is currently a staff writer for the Diplomat and editor-in-chief of Freedom Gazette, a policy advocacy site based in India. He also writes quite frequently on international affairs and key on foreign policy, international political economy, economic development, global governance. And he has also previously worked with different consulting firms and even governments. So he has also published on a range of media houses across the world. And okay, and we have moderator today, Dr. Ladhu Chaudhry, who is currently an assistant professor at the Department of Political Science, University of Rajasthan. Uh, he also taught at University of Delhi. He has PhD in international relations from Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi, and he specializes in military affairs, military strategy, and Indian foreign policy. So I welcome you all once again, and over to Dr. Ladhu for the rest of the session. Thank you. Ariba? Huh.
Dev, please allow
Yes,
the
yes.
speaker to start his talk. Sir is having problem joining us.
Okay, okay. So I'll welcome Mohamed Zeeshan to begin his including remarks on his books. Book.
Thank you, Professor, and thank you very much to the Association of Indian Research Scholars for having me here today to talk about my book, Flying Blind: India's Quest for Global Leadership. The purpose and rationale of this book, or its motivation, came from my travels and research around the world. Having worked in the Middle East as well as in the U.S. And at the United Nations briefly with the Indian delegation, I came across several anecdotes and observations that told me that India's global influence was far below its potential. I started out by first thinking about why Indians should worry about foreign policy and international affairs at all, because of the fact that we live in the world's largest democracy and there's always so much going on domestically in our politics and society and economy, why should Indians care at all about international affairs? Quite often, when I talk to Indian friends, this is what they ask me when I tell them that I'm writing about international affairs or international relations. But the fact of the matter is that because of the fact that India has grown into a globalized economy in the last several years, a lot of what happens abroad is very, very relevant for our own domestic development, growth, welfare, and interests. It's relevant to our diaspora abroad, which is the world's largest diaspora spread across every single country in the world. As I write my book, Flying Blind, except for three, it's also relevant to our students and workers and professionals abroad. It's also relevant to farmers and factory workers here at home because of the fact that a lot of their economic interactions depend on what's going on in the world outside. Obviously, our farmers and factory workers depend on trade negotiations, and that requires better bargaining chips for the Indian government so that they are able to get more favorable trade terms for our farmers and factory workers. Our fishermen, especially in South India, depend heavily on our relationship with countries like Sri Lanka in order to share the fisheries and water and marine resources that are there in South Asia. Obviously, our workers and professionals and students abroad require a stronger passport in order to access better economic job opportunities as well as study opportunities abroad. In my book, I write about the power of the Indian passport on the Henley Passport Index. India has traditionally done very poorly on the Henley Passport Index. We give, e-visas and visas on arrival to about 100 countries around the world, but in return, we get that only in about half that number when our people go abroad. So, this is a very key reason for the brain drain that India tends to suffer, as I write in my book. A lot of the time, when Indians are able to migrate abroad for work opportunities, they tend to change their citizenship and passport because they're not able to travel freely and transact business as freely on an Indian passport. And this is a huge loss as well to the Indian economy and to the Indian society and the republic back home. All of these are consequences of poor global influence. I say that India's government needs to be much more powerful and influential around the world in order to give Indian citizens a stronger passport, in order to give Indian workers and factory workers and fishermen and farmers here at home better trade terms. The Indian government needs to be much more influential and present abroad so that the Indian diaspora abroad is able to feel the safety and security of their government and they do not suffer in labor camps as many of them do in the Middle East or suffer from poor immigration policies as they do in many parts of the world. And so, therefore, that was the driving premise and rationale and purpose of my book, that India needs to assert itself and build greater global influence. Unfortunately, I find that India's influence on the world stage is not a very prominent part of India's foreign policy discourse, which tends to be largely focused on bilateral treaties and bilateral relationships. We do tend to speak about a permanent seat on the Security Council, but we tend not to talk very much about what that really would take on our part in order to get that kind of power and influence on the world stage. All of these are questions that I do deal with in my book. I talk about why India needs to grow its global influence. I talk about how India can grow its global influence. I do, of course, talk about the key strategic challenges that hold back India's global leadership, which is China's threat as well as the threats in South Asia. I talk about the opportunity of an alliance with the United States. I talk about an unexplored opportunity in international security and politics at the United Nations, where India can fill a very important gap in international security, which no other world power or emerging power at the moment is completely filling. All of these are themes that I have touched upon in my book. I do hope that it is able to create and spark debate and discussion in global discourse and especially in Indian discourse. And I look forward to speaking to the moderator, professor here, with me today. Thank you very much, Professor.
Okay, thank you, Jishan. You have very briefly summarized your book. I think it's Dr. Ladhu Chaudhry is here.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Thank you.
Please, over to you, Ladhuji.
Uh, Now I'm extremely sorry that due to technical reason I could not join on time, and my device has not supported this thing, so I have rushed to get my friend's device, and I'm joining. Thank you so much for the organizers to invite me here and to have to give me this opportunity to interact with great ideas that have been explored in Mohamed Zeeshan's book, Flying Blind. Uh, they are. I have went through the book. I have read almost uh, the entire book, and I found that the title of the book itself is a self-explanatory, as it clearly hints that India at present, and as it evolved from 1947, that it lacks a vision of global order. It also doesn't have strategy to engage with uh, the external world, and its relation with the external world is limited in scope, as it is most of the things that Jisan is rightly pointing out, that they are bilateral rather than multilateral. Whether it is in the closer neighbor in South Asia, or in at a far extended neighbor in Middle East, or at the global level, India has actually dealt bilaterally in terms of uh, this development assistance program, and otherwise there are such many issues. And the other point that he's actually highlighting in this book is that India has underutilized its power and potential. Uh, and if India could be following the same trend, that will be a big loss for India in the coming era. And he has also explored and emphasized that India has not explored the alternative options available to it. So, in that sense, because of these limitations, India is facing so many challenges as it aspires to become a global power. You have pointed out rightly that it is facing so many dilemmas in its foreign policy. So it would be great if you can highlight bit of dilemmas, because as of our understanding, that dilemmas in India's foreign policy uh, are evident, are yeah, are reality, because India's identity is also having so many contradictions and dilemmas. So please highlight some of the dilemmas that would be fruitful for to take the discussion further. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Chaudhry, for those extremely kind remarks. In my book, I do touch upon several dilemmas. I have categorized them into three broad categories. The first is neighborhood versus internationalist role. So, India does want to play a larger role in the broader world outside, so to speak. We do want to have a permanent seat in the Security Council. We think about ourselves as an emerging global power, not just as a regional power. But at the same time, India tends to be, severely crippled or obsessed with its immediate neighborhood. A lot of our strategic thinking is focused and based on the South Asian neighborhood, not outside. So we tend to generally, especially in our media and public discourse, a lot of the airtime that is given by the media is to China and Pakistan, and China only more recently, before that, mostly Pakistan. Outside of South Asia, there tends to be extremely limited awareness in the Indian foreign policy discourse, and as a result, India tends not to play as much of a role. Prime Minister Nehru, of course, as I write my book, had played a mediating role in Korea, in the Indochina, in the Congo, and so on. But after the war with China in 1962 and the end of Prime Minister Nehru's government, India started to turn more inward and began looking more at its immediate neighborhood, because that's where we felt our existential threats, so to speak, were coming from. So this is one dilemma. The second dilemma is that India wants to be a rule maker on the world stage, but at the same time, we do not want to take positions on key sensitive political questions around the world. In other words, we tend to sit on the fence. And so in my book, I say that fence sitting is a very key doctrine in Indian foreign policy. Many people in India think that because we sit on the fence, we are able to be friends with everybody. But at the same time, the fact of the matter is that if you are sitting on the fence, then you're not relevant to the issues that other people care about or other countries care about, because you do not have an opinion on them and you're not being useful. So if Israel and Palestine are fighting over the two-state solution between themselves, India tends to sit on the fence by and large. From time to time, we do talk about the two-state solution, but we have never acted upon it in a decisive manner. We have never mediated, so to speak, between the two sides. In Africa, there are several civil wars that are raging, but India tends not to be present in any manner or form in any of these political conflicts. In Syria, when the civil war was raging, India did not play any role at all. In Yemen, we did not play any role at all, except to evacuate our citizens post facto, so to speak. Similarly, in Afghanistan, until very recently, we were left out of the room because we did not play any kind of a role in the political and security debates that were taking place in Afghanistan outside of development projects and infrastructure projects. So we tend to sit on the fence on sensitive, important political questions. And as a result, we are not relevant to many of these questions and debates around the world. And as a result, we are not able to exert influence and be a rule maker, because only a country that has influence and has opinions on different issues and topics can be a rule maker. Everybody else ends up being a rule taker. So this is the second dilemma. The third dilemma is that even when India does take a stance, it is not coherent, it is not consistent. We are very, very frequently liable to take U-turns. And so I talk about the issue of democracy promotion, for instance, in my book. India does tend to oftentimes call itself a beacon of democracy. The prime minister across governments prime ministers have talked about how India is a democratic power on the world stage. Diplomats of the Indian Foreign Service at the UN and elsewhere oftentimes talk about democracy. When the US Secretary of State recently came, we talked about shared values. But apart from all of this, what do we really do in terms of democracy promotion? When push comes to shove in any part of the world, especially in the neighborhood, India tends not to be able to stick to this rhetoric very often. And so, in the Maldives, for instance, when President Mohamed Nasheed was deposed in a coup a few years ago, India did not play any role whatsoever, one way or the other. We tended to sit on the fence again. In Myanmar, we committed a U-turn essentially. In the 1980s, we were supporting democracy. But after that, in the 90s, we started reaching out to the military junta. And again, at this point in time, after Aung San Suu Kyi was put under house arrest, and there was yet another military coup, India found itself on the fence. It was not sure whether to support democracy or not. The Indian Foreign Ministry had made statements saying that India would like to support democracy, but at the same time, when the debate came to the UN, in various councils of the UN, we actually ended up siding with China in order to thwart strong condemnation of the military coup in Myanmar. So we tend to commit U-turns, and as a result, in a country like Myanmar, for instance, neither the democracy activists nor really the military regime is able to trust India fully, because neither of them is quite certain which way India's ambitions and aspirations or intentions really lie. And they are not sure whether we are going to change our view one way or the other. So this is the third dilemma. And as a result, I think that India is unable to take a coherent, consistent stance, make itself a reliable partner to any constituency of support anywhere in the world. And as a result, we tend to not be an influential power. I think you're on mute, Dr. Chaudhry.
Yeah. Sorry. So I think this is a wonderful take that you are bringing these dilemmas out, and this will have a very much relevant for the academic, shaping the academic discourse on Indian foreign policy as well as the policymakers sitting in the Ministry of External Affairs. Uh, Dr. Mohammad Zeeshan, I read your book and I found that you are very well in terms of connecting or narrating historical events to the present context. And you have given very like simple illustration, but very serious illustration. For example, you have mentioned that Indian diplomacy is connecting with the circus that we used to have in India, and now we don't have it, and it's like Europe walk. And then you connect the Indian foreign policy with the tiger who eats grass. And here we find that these are the good illustrations. Uh, and this also shows that Indian foreign policy has this kind of typical characteristics in a global order. And you mentioned that uh, India is actually not following the Nehruvian tradition, which is grass-eating tiger, rather than India are following footsteps of Indira Gandhi in their foreign policy. You have mentioned that one can firmly make the case that the more influential voice in modern India foreign policy is that of Indira Gandhi, not of Jawaharlal Nehru. I'm coming from political science and did my master's in international relations from JNU. What Indian academia and Indian university system have on curricula is the Nehruvian foreign policy and its footprint. We hardly teach and hardly see any readings and references to the Indira Gandhi's, except the Munro doctrine or Indira doctrine. This that short note or a comment on that. More than that, there's nothing. So how your this assertion comes from, whether it comes from the U.S. perspectives or the foreign policy exercise from other world, because we don't teach, or maybe it is in a practice that is not connected with the Indian academia. So if you can highlight this typical characteristics of Indian foreign policy from peacemaker to security seeker, as Zorawar Daulat puts in his book, and Hugh highlights it also in this. So what are the connects, and what are the, uh, as we feel in India that there are so much of Nehruvian legacy that is still, drags back the Indian foreign policy. Yeah,
Sorry, can you repeat that question because we cut off somewhere in the middle there for a few seconds?
yeah. I'm saying that here in India, the debates are much more oriented towards Nehruvian imprints on Indian foreign policy rather than Indira Gandhi's imprints on Indian foreign policy. Whereas you are suggesting that after Nehru, Indira Gandhi's like role and Indira Gandhi's vision of foreign policy is much more in practice than the Nehruvian thing. So how you make that assessment?
Well, look, when Nehru was a prime minister, he was a much more internationalist prime minister, and even in his generation, Jawaharlal Nehru was somewhat unusual, I would say, in the sense that, he was a very globalized citizen, so to speak, was obviously educated abroad, but in many ways, even culturally speaking, he was extremely westernized. And he was obviously a very fluent English speaker, and other things. Oftentimes followed international politics much more closely than many of his cabinet colleagues. Of course, he wrote the book Glimpses of World History, which reads as an encyclopedia of world history even to this day. And so, therefore, Prime Minister Nehru, in many ways, was a very internationalist personality. He had a global outlook in his way of policy making and governance. And that, I think, in many ways also spilt over into Indian foreign policy under him. In my book, I say that most of Indian strategic thinking over the centuries, starting right back from Chanakya himself, was very neighborhood centric and neighborhood focused, because India had, for most part of its civilizational existence, there were several kingdoms in the Indian subcontinent. And so, therefore, strategic thinking and foreign policy in many ways was about dealing with your neighboring kingdom, which was still within South Asia for the most bit. So, a lot of the Indian strategic thinking or thinkers over the years were very neighborhood centric. And Prime Minister Nehru, in some ways, with his internationalist outlook, thinking about the Congo, thinking about Korea, thinking about the Indochina, thinking about India's role in the Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union, these were big ticket global or multilateral questions on which Prime Minister Nehru had built his foreign policy. He did not, of course, he did have the wars with Pakistan, but he still made sure that even though, for instance, India was fighting the war with China in 1962, some people would actually obviously doubt him or blame him for it, and with good reason. A part of the Indian army during that war was actually fighting with the peacekeeping forces in the Congo, which India was leading. And so, therefore, Prime Minister Nehru had kept his global outlook alive. He did not pull back India's leadership of the UN peacekeeping troops in the Congo because of the war with China. Many people would rightly argue that he should have done that, because India, in some ways, in many ways, did not have the material strength and resources to play the sort of globalist role that Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru was trying to play. And yet there, and yet he did want, that was his vision, so to speak, and that's what he was trying to do. But with that war with China in 1962 and the end of Prime Minister Nehru's term, and and his death, India sort of realized that its material strength was still very weak and rather limited. India was still a very young democracy. A lot of our people were heavily impoverished. Literacy rates were quite low at the time, in the 60s and 70s. Famines were very common as well. And so when Prime Minister Indira Gandhi took over, a lot of her efforts were actually domestic in nature rather than internationalist in nature. She had to fight the famines at home, and so we had the Green Revolution. As a result of the victory, or rather the defeat against China in 1962, she decided that she had to spend more of her time and resources and effort in rebuilding the Indian military and setting it up for future success, which it then achieved in the war with Pakistan in 1961, or rather 1971. And so the war with China in 1962, in some sense, brought back Indian strategic thinking to the neighborhood from the international stage, where Prime Minister Nehru was trying to operate for most part of his term in office. And in that sense, I think in some sense, India had gone back to the way that it had worked or rather Indian strategic thinking had gone back to the way that it had worked through the centuries when Indira Gandhi became the Prime Minister. And if you ask me, to this day, I think that India's focus tends to be more internal, more neighborhood centric, as it had been under Prime Minister Indira Gandhi. She was the one who changed all of that after the end of Nehru's term. Of course, Lal Bahadur Shastri was in office, but very briefly. Most of the paradigm shift from the internationalist outlook in Indian foreign policy to the neighborhood centric outlook actually happened under Prime Minister Indira Gandhi. She decided that Pakistan was an existential threat that needed to be neutralized. And so, as a result, there was the War of Liberation of Bangladesh in 1971, which formed the highlight of her term in office. And since then, I don't think that any prime minister has really attempted to take Indian foreign policy beyond that. I think in the last couple of governments, of course, in the 1990s, we had Prime Minister Narasimha Rao, who had talked about the Look East foreign policy outlook. But I think even so, by and large, India's role, India's strategic thinking tends to be much more focused on the neighborhood. And then, of course, we had Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, who tried to take India into various decision-making councils on the world stage, which we achieved over a period of time. The MTCR, for instance, and of course now we've got an elected term of 2 years in the Security Council. We had that under the previous government as well. And so we are trying to develop our footprint at the UN, so to speak. And yet, at the same time, a lot of India's strategic thinking continues to be focused on the neighborhood. We are still thinking about how do we resolve the border dispute with China, or rather, how do we fight the military threat from China? We are obviously still thinking about, the counter-terrorism or cross-border terrorism threat from Pakistan. A lot of our efforts and time is obviously still consumed, so to speak, by the immediate neighborhood, and that leaves us with very little to go back to playing a more internationalist role in terms of mediating conflicts around the world, as we had done under Prime Minister Nehru all those years ago. So, in that sense, I think that India tends to still be following the Indira Gandhi neighborhood-centric foreign policy, outline.
Yeah, that's well argued. And I do agree with you that India's foreign policy is inward looking rather than outward looking. We are agree on that point. Uh, but when it comes to study on Indian foreign policy, as you have also rightly pointed out, that is most of like bilateral relations. It's an area specific foreign policy take. And the other trend we find on most of the studies on Indian foreign policy is it is driven by personality factor. For example, Nehru's foreign policy, Modi's foreign policy, Indira's foreign policy, Gujarat's foreign policy, and so on. So you have mentioned in somewhere in your book that non-alignment, peace, internationalism, that may be argued as Nehru's foreign policy rather than India's foreign policy. So my question for the audience and those who are joining us and to enlighten us is that if we have to distill personality-oriented foreign policy characteristics from the larger India's foreign policy, how can we do that? Because from 1947 to till today, if we keep the personality-oriented foreign policy take separate and distill something from all the commonalities, and we come up with some kind of India's foreign policy or Indian foreign policy, what could be that? Uh, that thing.
Look, I mean, the reason that I call my book Flying Blind is because, in many ways, I think India does not have an Indian foreign policy. And therefore, it tends to be heavily influenced by personalities. But, I think the one common thread that we can find probably across governments is the fact that India wants to identify itself as a democratic power on the world stage. We want to still talk about the fact that we are the world's largest democracy. We do want to talk about the fact that we are a multicultural democracy, that we have got diversity and religious diversity, linguistic diversity, and all of that other stuff. And so, in that sense, I think that characteristic of India tends to be the only constant across different governments in terms of the way that they respond to rhetoric, at least on the world stage. But otherwise, I think what happens quite often with Indian foreign policy is that we tend to be very reactionary. We tend to act in an ad hoc manner. So, suppose there is an incursion from the Chinese side today, then we immediately respond to that particular incursion. There is no broader analysis or rather strategic thinking, I think, in Indian foreign policy that, tries to analyze why China is doing this. What is China's long-term game in trying to keep India occupied, so to speak, on its Himalayan border? How do we try to build our bargaining chips and influence to counter China? Is China, first of all, a friend or a foe? I think for the longest period of time, India has been very confused on a lot of these very basic fundamental questions. Whether China is a friend or foe, what kind of norms and institutions do we stand for on the world stage? How do we envision global governance, so to speak? Is America an ally to be relied on? And where do they fit in with the non-aligned movement? I mean, India is still a part of the non-aligned movement. So what does being non-aligned mean in today's context, where India is a part of the Quad with the US and sees China as a threat? And at the same time, India is also counting Russia as an ally. However, Russia is also a Chinese ally. So there is a lot of dissonance and incoherence, I think, in some sense, in Indian strategic thinking. And so as a result, we tend to act in a very ad hoc manner. Now, when you act in an ad hoc manner, what happens is that it becomes personality driven, because there is no guidebook that is sitting there on the prime minister's desk saying that this is the way that India has tended to follow these things in the last several years. This is India's foreign policy outlook, and this is India's strategic thinking outlook. There is no such clear cut picture, I think, so to speak. And so when the prime minister, whichever prime minister he is or she is, looks at a certain crisis, they are thinking, okay, how do I react to this? They're not thinking about, okay, what has India's tendency been whenever we have been faced by this challenge. And so therefore it becomes a personalized foreign policy as a result. So I think that is part of the broader problem that I'm trying to highlight. I think India needs to ask itself these basic questions. How do we promote democracy abroad if we want to stand up for democracy? What do we do whenever there is a military coup in one of our neighboring countries? Are we going to actually stand for democracy, or are we just going to talk about it? What do we do when there are civil wars happening in the Middle East, where there's a very large diaspora of Indians living there, right? How do we understand and analyze China's intentions? What does China want to achieve in Asia? What does China want to achieve vis-a-vis India? And as a result, how does India then negotiate all of these things? First of all, what does India want? And whether that is in conflict with China. If it is not in conflict with China, then why is China even a threat? So I think these basic fundamental questions are what are missing. And if we have answered all of this, then we end up with a very coherent Indian foreign policy, so to speak.
Yeah, very, very, very enlightening inputs. And I think in your books, you seems very optimistic that India would play a proactive role in terms of promotion of democracy and preservation of human rights at a global level. But when we see the current regime's credentials on the democracy and human rights, on both the indicators, we find a steady decline in it, or at least the government's commitment towards it in credentials for the locals, Indians. And as you have mentioned that the democratic power or multiculturalism or diversity, I think all of these variables at present are under decline, or we can say that number of people are saying that under threat. So is in this kind of situation, when the situation at home is worse in terms of promotion of democracy or preservation of human rights, how can India take a global role? Or are you suggesting that due to India's growing economic power and its strategic importance, it will automatically the responsibility will come to India because it is coming as a significant power, as US is relatively declining and China is rising, so the global community or international community will automatically shoulder this responsibility on India. Are you suggesting that India's democratic credentials are so strong to that extent that when US is being criticized for its demerits in democracies or its not seriousness in the democracies, because realists would argue that democracy promotion would be only a tool, as what we see in Afghanistan, that project has been started to establish a democratic government, and now US is talking to Taliban and Taliban is coming to power. So in that kind of larger scenario that we are seeing at most of the failed states are coming up, there are so much of rebellion and revolution and secessionist movement on the parameters of self-determination is coming up, and India is actually facing all the problems that any country in the Middle East or a South Asian country is facing, whether it's a cultural secessionist or self-determination. So I think the one of the point that we can consider here for the discussion, or you can highlight on that, why India is not taking a proactive role on the global issues, because all the global problems from balkanization to the Syria, we see that all problems replicate some kind of Indian problem, internal problems. So India, if supports these kind of movements there, it actually creates problem at home. So this democracy promotion and human rights preservation agenda can really help India to take a global leadership role?
No, you're absolutely right. I think that the recent sort of backsliding, so to speak, in Indian democratic credentials is a big blow to India. I talk about why India should promote democracy and human rights in my book in length. For one, of course, it's the diaspora. The diaspora is a very big part of why India should promote democracy, because in any democratic society the Indian diaspora becomes a very politically active and influential community. And so, as a result, it also becomes a powerful tool for Indian foreign policy. We've seen that in the US, we've seen that in Australia, where the uranium exports ban was lifted. All of these things were actually also in part as a result of the efforts of the Indian diaspora in these countries. So, in a democratic society, we see that the Indian diaspora becomes a much more influential tool, and that gives India a huge incentive to promote democracy around the world. At the same time, I think you're absolutely right. I think India has gotten to a point where it does not want to talk about Xinjiang, it does not want to talk about Palestine, it does not want to talk about all of these problematic areas around the world. But because as soon as that happens, then India is afraid that the world will say, oh, what's happening in India? What is happening in Kashmir? Why is the internet shut down for so many months? Why are these people under house arrest? So all of these questions will start coming up. And so India, in some sense, is unfortunately trying to fly under the radar. You don't become a world leader by flying under the radar. You only become a world leader by being influential and important, and that means you get noticed. And in India's case, unfortunately, it does not want to get noticed. The other part of this, of course, is that if India's democracy is not credible, then people around the world are not going to see India's democratic advocacy as being credible either. And that is very important. The reason that I say India should support democracy movements around the world is also in large part because democracy activists around the world have traditionally looked up to India as a supporter or a sponsor. It's even happened in China, for instance. There have been dissidents from China that have looked to hold their conferences here in India in the past. And the Dalai Lama, of course, is on exile in India. And so therefore, a lot of democracy activists around the world look at India as a model to be replicated, or have looked at India as a model to be replicated over the years. And this is what gives India the sort of influence that it requires over these constituencies around the world. In the Maldives, for instance, Nasheed is a very close ally of India. And in some of these countries, even they are so reliant on India's support for democracy that these leaders even speak out against China whenever there is Chinese investment taking place in their country. We saw that with President Sirisena, for instance, in Sri Lanka. President Sirisena came to power in 2015, fighting against President Rajapaksa at that point in time, Mahinda Rajapaksa at that point in time, also in part by talking about Chinese quote unquote neo-colonization in Sri Lanka. And a large part of his election plank was, we have got to rebuild our bridges with India. And then he visited India as his first state visit once he became president. So people who are fighting for democracy have traditionally looked up to India as an ally, because India is a credible democracy, because India is the land of Mahatma Gandhi and Bal Gangadhar Tilak and all of these, pro-democracy activists and freedom fighters. And that is a very big part of India's reputational legacy on the world stage. Now, if India becomes, less than a democracy, or it becomes a quote-unquote elected autocracy, then democracy activists around the world are no longer going to rely or find India reliable, because they will then say, okay, this is what is happening in India. How can India fight for us if they are not even able to stand up for these things at home? And India, as a result, as I said, does not want to talk about these issues around the world, because if it talks about these issues, then immediately the global spotlight will also be on human rights problems and challenges here in India. So it is a very large part. And I have not even come to the most important part of why India's democracy is important, which is that India's democracy is the source of its economic growth. I don't think India can have economic growth without its democracy, because it's in the absence of democracy A country like India cannot enjoy political stability. And in my book, I've talked about several countries around the world, in Asia and Africa and Latin America, that have not been able to build sustainable economic growth because they simply have not had political stability, because there was no democracy. And so every time somebody wanted to change the government, they had to go and assassinate the president. There would be rebel militias, there would be armies clashing against them, there would be civil wars, and then the civil wars would occur and recur over and over again. India has escaped this vicious cycle because it has a functional multicultural democracy. The election mandate is by and large respected by every community and every citizen in India. And this is a very important part of India's political stability and growth story. The moment India loses its democracy, there is going to be a lot of simmering tensions and conflict, because many communities are going to find that they are not going to be heard anymore. They would feel that they do not have a voice and stake in India anymore. And as a result, the chances of violence will increase, as it has happened in other, sort of authoritarian societies around the world.
Yeah, very wonderful. That the democracy contradictions within democracy and democracy promotion is, or democracy per se is never is a reaching threshold anywhere in the world. So you are suggesting that democracy in India is still evolving, and it's going in the right direction. And I think we all believe in it, that democracy is the best model of governance so far in the world. Uh, Now, taking from here, we can discuss that your chapter on China's dream and the American international order. Uh, what we see in India here under Modi's regime presently, that India is trying to develop a manufacturing hub. It's trying to becoming a manufacturing hub like India, and at the same time, we are also suggesting that India should build up the international institutions. And if we see the Indian foreign policy at this point of time, uh, India is taking a middle way. It's a middle path. On the one hand, it seems to be a savior of the international liberal order, uh, dominated by and built up by the American hegemony. And on the other hand, it also seems to be a part of or active participant of the new international order led by China, whether it is being a part of the Asian Development Bank or SCO, Shanghai Cooperation, or there are so many initiatives where on climate change. There are so many initiatives on which on Chinese, Indians are supporting the Chinese cause also, or the Chinese vision of international order. Now the dilemma for the rest of the world, as you are suggesting that India should lead, and India would definitely lead, it's time for India now to lead. Are these trends of India's foreign policy balancing or walking on both the boats is actually confusing its followers? Uh, uh, so how Indian foreign policy should be, uh, or it should be tilted towards American international system or liberal international order, or it should be more prone to the Chinese vision of it. No doubt, nobody would say that it should be more on Chinese side, but it's also clear that there's a well argued literature that India is not happy with the existing international liberal order. A lot of
No, this is
literature says,
yeah.
for example, Ambassador Shiv Shankar Menon's book, recent book, India and Asian Geopolitics, clearly suggests that India is actually not cherishing this international liberal order, because international liberal order has always been built up to suppress the India's role in the global affairs in some sense, if not acceptably, not openly, but there's a hidden agenda to it. And Nehru and others have always opposed some of the fundamental institutions of this present order. And Chinese are giving a bit kind of opportunity to India to exercise its vision for post-colonial world order, for developing world order. So what kind of take India should strike a balance to build its hybrid vision, or the vision that you are outlining in the last chapter of your book, that what vision India should follow. So if you can highlight some of the points, that will be very useful for the discussion. Thank you.
Well, I mean, one of the reasons that India is, able to keep one foot on either boat is because India is not clear about what it stands for again, And so, for instance, in my book, I, talk about the difference between the World Bank and the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which India and China co-founded. The World Bank was essentially part of what people call the quote unquote liberal international order. It believed in free market systems, it believed in market capitalism, it believed in access to capital for entrepreneurs. In the new era now, it believes in sort of cutting down on emissions and environmental protections and assessments, human rights considerations as well. And so the World Bank tends not to lend as easily to countries that suffer from poor human rights records. Whereas on the other hand, you've got the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank that actually believes or says that it wants to lend with no strings attached. So even if you are a human rights abuser, whether you are Gaddafi or you are Bashar al-Assad, you will get funds from the AIIB without any discrimination. Whether you are an authoritarian system or not, you will get get those funds. In terms of environmental impact assessment, the AIIB is very, very sketchy again. It believes sort of more in loosening its purse strings, not trying to judge the borrower, not trying to judge the way that they treat the environment, not trying to judge the way that they treat their laborers, whether there are labor rights for these factories or not. These things are not concerned so far as the AIIB's lending portfolio is concerned, unlike the World Bank. So this is, in some sense, the competing visions of America and China. China wants to believe that state sovereignty is paramount. As far as a state is sovereign, it is free to do whatever it wants to its people and within its borders, in terms of any parameter. Whereas the liberal international order believes there should be global norms, there should be a set of rules and laws that everybody follows. Just because you are a sovereign state, you cannot do anything and everything you want. And so this is, in some sense, the two competing models as I see them today between China and the US. Now, the challenge for India is that the US liberal international order was essentially built by a pack of friends from the West. And so, it was obviously spearheaded in 1945 at the end of the Second World War. America and its allies came together. They built the UN, they built the World Bank, they built the IMF. India tends to have, as a result of the fact that India is not part of the West, India tends to not have a seat at the table in many of these America-led global institutions. I think in some sense that is India's biggest grouse. I have not found so far India actually coming out with a very hard and fast opposition to any of the norms that are proposed by the World Bank, so to speak, or the UN, so to speak. I don't think India would count itself, or rather the rest of the world certainly does not see India as an enemy of the Bretton Woods institutions, because India has not made itself an enemy. It has never come out and opposed the US on anything that it says and does. In fact, for instance, on the freedom of navigation issue in the South China Sea and the Indian Ocean, India actually aligns with the American model, not with the Chinese model, right? India does talk about state sovereignty quite often, but at the same time, India also talks about democracy and human rights. So in Myanmar, for instance, India has quite clearly said that India wants to promote democracy. In Nepal, what did India do? India had actually stood up for the rights of the Madeshis in Nepal when the Nepalese constitution came out. So India does not really practice in many ways, or does not truly believe in many ways, in the state sovereignty supreme concept. We only talk about it. We tend to use it in terms of fence sitting outside of the neighborhood. So whenever we want to sit on the fence in Syria or Libya or Yemen or elsewhere, we immediately say that, oh, it's a sovereign state, and then we vote the way that China does, because we do not want to get in some sense, our hands dirty in any international crisis or conflict. But at the same time, on most of the issues where norms of international or global governance are concerned, India tends to align more with America. Now, my theory, or rather argument in my book, is that India needs to be very clear about what it wants to stand for. And that has to be based on India's national interests. What is India's national interest? In my book, I argue, for one, that democracy and human rights is clearly a national interest for India. In many ways, actually, India has a more realist interest in democracy promotion than even America itself does, because of the diaspora and these other things. At the same time, India's economic growth model is not a state led growth model. India had state led socialism up until the 1990s. It did not lead to much economic growth. Then India opened up its economy to the private sector in 1991 with the liberalization reforms. It opened up to trade and globalization. Today, if you compare the Indian economy and the Chinese economy is heavily state led. But India's economy, about 75% of India's GDP, I think last year or 2 years ago, as I write in my book, came from the private sector, not from the public sector. So India's economic growth model is a market capitalism oriented model. That is what has created, close to double digit growth in the last 30 years. And so that is what we want to stick by, whether it is Modi government or any other government. The key thrust of political, electoral politics in India is to reform the economy. Everybody is talking about reforming the economy today, unlike 50 years ago. So in that sense, I think that India tends to align more with the market capitalism model. In my book, I also then analyze the lending patterns of the World Bank and the IMF. The World Bank has tended to lend heavily to India because of the congruence on many of these parameters so far as global norms are concerned. So India, I think, in many ways does have its basic core political and economic interests so far as India is concerned, aligns with the United States. It aligns with the liberal international order. We want to see American rules and norms in the South China Sea, in the Indian Ocean. We wanted the NATO forces to stay on in Afghanistan, unlike China, because they were also giving protection and security to India's democracy promotion movement and initiatives in Afghanistan, such as building the parliament, and observing Afghan elections and other things such as that. So in many ways, India already aligns. I think it's a matter of us actually making this a formal part of our foreign policy today.
Yeah, your ideas are really thought-provoking and refreshing. Now I think we can take it further, but I think we should give opportunity to audience. If organizers are allowing and there are somebody to have questions, then we can take questions from them, and then we can discuss some more issues. That's important issues mentioned in your book. Ariba?
So the questions are floating on the screen. If you can ask them. Thank you.
Yeah, I can see a question here.
Yeah.
Somebody has asked, what are the causes behind India underutilizing its material power in the post-Indira phase? I think that's a very interesting question. In my book, for instance, I compare, a lot of people do say that India is a poor country, we do not have resources and so on. But in my book, I compare the cases of Japan and Russia. Russia's economy is far weaker today than India's economy, despite all of our challenges and troubles that we are facing. Russia, as a result of sanctions imposed by the West for several years following the Crimea crisis in 2014, has seen its economy in the doldrums. I think it went through recession a few times as well in the last few years. And the oil prices are very volatile, and that also affected Russia. Russia was not able to export to its largest trade partner, which is the EU, because of EU sanctions. Japan, on the other hand, is an economic power, very powerful economy. One of the leading lights. I think it's the one of the largest exporters and importers in the world as well. And certainly, insofar as rankings go, Japan's economic rankings far outstrip Russia's economic rankings. But at the same time, I would say, most people would say, that Russia is a more powerful and influential country in the world stage than Japan. Whenever there is a crisis in Syria, for instance, Russia is the one that you call to the table, not Japan. Whenever there is a crisis in Iran, for instance, Russia is the one that you call to the table, not Japan. In Afghanistan, again, it is Russia, not Japan. In the South China Sea, even, it is now increasingly Russia and not Japan. So, what is the reason, I ask in my book, that Russia is much more powerful than Japan, even though Russia is more materially, Japan is much more materially powerful than Russia. Russia is more politically influential around the world than Japan. The key, the key reason in my mind, of course, there are several reasons. One is the fact that Russia has a stronger military. Japan, as a result of its pacifist constitution, does not have as strong a military. Russia is a permanent member in the Security Council, has a veto vote. Japan does not have that. But yet, at the same time, I think what Russia has done under Vladimir Putin, for all of his human rights violations at home, is that Putin, as president, has a very clear-cut foreign policy vision. He knows who his allies are. He knows what he wants to stand for. He knows what norms he wants to stand for in global governance. Whenever there is a civil war or conflict anywhere in the world, he's very clear about who his constituencies are. He's very clear about whom to support, why he should support them. He has very reliable allies on the ground. And these allies also know that they can trust and rely on Russia, because Russia is not going to turn its back on them most of the time. It has a very coherent, consistent foreign policy. Now, India, unfortunately, does not have a coherent, consistent foreign policy. No constituency of support or ally anywhere in the world today, including the United States, is really sure about what India is going to support them on, what India is not going to support them on. For instance, if you take the US, for several years now, India has told the US that we want to stand up for freedom of navigation in the South China Sea. But what has India done in terms of supporting freedom of navigation in the South China Sea? We have been, very, very skeptical about any military exercises. I think up until about 2019, India did not take part in any joint patrols in the South China Sea with the US or any of its allies. And so, as a result, I think the US is not very clear about what it can count on India for its support, what it cannot count on India for its support. So, these issues and these policy stances are not very clear and coherent. The moment India is very clear and coherent about what it wants to achieve in foreign policy, whom it wants to support, what policy positions it wants to take on key sensitive political questions, I think you will find that India becomes a much more influential power on the world stage. Okay, there's another question here. Do you think, I don't know, Professor, are you able to read these questions? Do you think Modi's policies in recent years? Yeah. So it says, do you think Modi's policies in recent years is a course correction in this regard? For example, his connecting with the Indian diaspora. I will say that Prime Minister Narendra Modi, when he first came to power in 2014, came to power with the intention to correct course. In one of his early statements to interactions with Indian diplomats, I think ambassadors, I've referenced this in my book. Prime Minister Modi said, I want India to be a leading power, not a balancing power. In other words, he did not want to sit on the fence. He said the days of non-alignment in some sense are over. Let's take a clear-cut position on every single issue in world politics and thereby become a leading power rather than just following somebody or putting one foot in each boat. And then, of course, as a question points out, he also connected with the Indian diaspora. There were large concert-like, events in Sydney and in New York, and thousands of Indian people attended them in these countries. But I think what has happened, unfortunately, in the last few years is that the initial sort of momentum has fizzled out. And so, as a result, you saw Professor was saying some time back, India now has a foot in each boat. It has a foot in the American boat as well as in the Chinese boat. So that means we are again back to being balancing power. We are not a leading power, as Prime Minister Modi had said he would like us to be. We continue to sit on the fence on most issues in Myanmar, in Maldives, in Afghanistan, in Syria, Iraq. We continue to sit on the fence. In terms of the diaspora, I think there is one very unfortunate trend that has taken place in recent years, in the last couple of years, and that is the polarization of the Indian diaspora. I think in the past, Indian diaspora was a very, very reliable foreign policy tool. They would stand up for whatever New Delhi would say. But in the last couple of years, you've got a series of protests that have taken place in front of Indian consulates and embassies around the world, particularly in the West. And in fact, I wrote in one of my articles for The Diplomat, when Kamala Harris became the vice presidential candidate in the US, I wrote about how Indian Americans are now very polarized. A lot of the Indian American population are supporters of the Democratic Party. But what had happened under Donald Trump is that the Indian government had become a very vocal supporter of Donald Trump, including even at one point in time, I think Prime Minister Narendra Modi was accused quite rightly of supporting Donald Trump in the US presidential elections, at least rhetorically. So I think in that sense, the Indian diaspora became polarized. We saw a lot of Indian Americans in the Democratic Party, like Pramila Jayapal, for instance, or Kamala Harris herself, taking positions that criticize the Indian government on Kashmir, on the Citizenship Amendment Act, and these other things. And that led to a series of face-offs with the Indian government as well. When Foreign Minister Jaishankar went to Washington under Donald Trump's administration, he refused to meet with Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal, and that obviously ticked off and offended a number of her Indian American colleagues in the Democratic Party. So I think in that sense, the Indian diaspora is now polarized. It is not quite as vocal a supporter for the government of India as it used to be in the past. Parts of the Indian diaspora continue to be vocal supporters, but they also are supporters of Hindu nationalism. And parts of the Indian diaspora are very alarmed by the growth of communal rhetoric in India and communal clashes within India. And they see in this a threat to Indian democracy, quite vocally speak about this as well. And as a result, they have become, in some sense, a less effective tool for Indian foreign policy. And this is, I think, very unfortunate.
Yeah, Zeeshan, I'm completely agree with you that Indian diaspora is polarized. And much more than that, if we read E.T. Ibrahim's account, how India became territorial, where we find that India's diaspora policy from pre-independence to the post-independence has always been contradictory, because India has supported diaspora for some times, and then they have not supported diaspora, and they have supported diaspora of different kind. And if we see in recent times that diaspora from the Western country and diaspora residing in the Middle East are getting a differential treatment in Indian foreign policy, because that Western country diasporas are actually not bringing that much of remittances, direct remittances to India, whereas the people who went to Middle East and served as laborer and migrations, they are having different kind of problems. But Indian missions, diplomatic missions, and Indian political leadership is less concerned about their, their problems. So definitely there's a polarization, there are contradictions within diaspora policy of Indian government, and therefore it's a great subject of research that the contemporary uh, regime under Modi is how it is dealing with the diaspora. Now we have another question. Can any state be certain when you talk about confusion about China relations with US? So I think question is here is that is India is having so many dilemmas, or every country is facing some kind of dilemma like US and China? Are Indian dilemma some unique here?
No, this is a very smart question, and the answer, frankly, is no. I think a lot of countries around the world are stuck in this dilemma. They're absolutely right. And what happens, I think, is that a lot of middle powers around the world, for instance, Australia, wants to play both sides. Quite obviously, I think it is in the interest of middle powers to play non-alignment politics between global superpowers, because as a result of that, they're able to actually get gains from both sides. But what has happened now in the case of Australia, Australia is a very interesting example, I think, because under previous prime ministers such as Kevin Rudd, for instance, Australia had taken a very positive, optimistic outlook towards China. Kevin Rudd was one of the most pro-Chinese prime ministers of Australia. His successor, Julia Gillard, in many ways also took a sort of pro-China stance. Mandarin was being taught in schools across Australia at that point in time, about 10 years ago. But what has happened in the last couple of years, I think, and especially in the last 1 year, is that China has started to bring aggression into its bilateral relationship with Australia as well. Australia had started to speak out, for instance, on the human rights violations in Tibet and Xinjiang and Taiwan and Hong Kong. Australia tends to get a lot of refugees from a lot of these provinces of China. And so Australia has an interest in speaking out about these violations as well. And China had, as a result, started to fight a trade war with Australia. Imports were banned out of Australia. I think Australian beef was banned. Australia had retaliated by putting tariffs on Chinese imports as well. And then that became a whole other thing. And now I think you will find China, or rather Australia, is one of the most China skeptic countries in the world. Yet, I think that a lot of middle powers would like to play both sides, balancing role, as Prime Minister Modi had put in his speech to the Indian ambassadors. But India needs to ask itself whether India wants to be a balancing power, a middle power, playing both sides, being a sort of a inconsequential swing state, not really taking a leading role, not really setting the rules of the game, not really setting norms of global governance. In that case, you can be a balancing power. That is what middle powers tend to do. But I don't think that India wants to be a middle power. I don't think India wants to be a balancing power. And certainly, I don't think India deserves to be a middle power either. India is the largest democracy in the world. India is the second largest country in the world, population wise. India is a nuclear power state. Australia is not. India does have the world's largest diaspora around the world. India, I think in my book, I write that India is the third largest military power in the world as well. So, in many ways, India is a large and consequential country which chooses to be inconsequential in world affairs by trying to be a balancing power, by trying to be a middle power. If India wants, India can become a large power if India is able to deploy its resources in a much more coherent strategic manner than it has been doing in the last few years. So I think it's really a choice whether India wants to be stuck in this dilemma or not. Most countries around the world do not have a choice in this dilemma. But I think India, as a consequence of its large size, its demographic dividend, its large diaspora, its nuclear power arsenal, all of these other things, I think India is in a position to make a choice whether it wants to be a rule setter or whether it wants to be a rule taker.
Yeah, I agree with you, and it's a very interesting thing that you are bringing out. But as you know, that somewhere I think former Prime Minister Manmohan Singh has said that no action is also an action, and no policy is also a policy, and exercising no choice is also a choice. So in
Yeah,
that
that's true.
sense, that sense, India must be thinking or must be playing a multiple roles at a time, because on certain issues, India must be playing a leading role. On certain issue, it is seems as be a, as you rightly pointed out, fence sitting. Somewhere it is also playing a balancing role. Somewhere it is also bandwagoning, and on many issues it is also following the policy of flip flop that you have mentioned in your book. Uh, I have two or three more questions. We will discuss this later. Now there's another question on the screen. This question is: do you think human rights can be a major driver of international relations in case of India?
Look, I think that this is a choice that Indian foreign policy makers should make. In my book, I say that if India stands up for human rights around the world, it will increase India's influence and relevance around the world. For several reasons that I've written in my book and also talked about in our discussion today. But if India does not want to have human rights as a part of its foreign policy guidebook, so to speak, or its foreign policy strategy, so to speak, then that is another decision that you make. As a result of that, you do not gain influence with groups and lobbies in different countries that are fighting for human rights in their countries. India can, of course, also do what China does, which is take the side of the oppressive regime in any country. So China has in the past sponsored and supported dictators such as Omar Bashir in Sudan, for instance. It has supported and sponsored Bashar al-Assad in Syria. It is now trying to build some kind of a linkage with the Taliban and become a sponsor and supporter of the Taliban in Afghanistan. And China's policy is that it supports state sovereignty, does not care about human rights. It thinks that human rights violations are actually justified, that there are good reasons to do human rights violations, and so therefore it supports the government wherever it is in power, whoever is in power. And so as a result, I think China is able to gain influence with the government in power, whether it is in Sri Lanka, in Iran, in Syria, in Sudan, in Zimbabwe, or wherever else, because the dictator in power knows that he can rely on China for Chinese support. The dictator in power does not know that he can rely on India for India's support. Therefore, he does not trust India. Therefore, India does not enjoy influence in his country. Now, India can either choose to support the dictator, or India can choose to support human rights activists and advocates in that country. That is a choice that India needs to make. Or, as Professor pointed out, India can decide to make no choice and sit on the fence, in which case, as I argue in my book, India will not enjoy influence at all. But whatever choice India makes, it needs to be consistent with its own interests, with its own domestic systems, because that is the only way it can be sustainable over a period of time. It cannot be that this government makes one decision today and then there is a change in government tomorrow and the new government says that we do not want to follow this policy anymore. We are going to support a different ally. Now, what happens if you do that kind of a U-turn is that any ally that you are cultivating abroad finds that you are not a reliable ally, right? Because you are liable to change your position tomorrow. One of the key reasons that I say India should stand for human rights is because India is a democracy. There is a human rights activism lobby in India. Now, today you might have one government. Tomorrow, a government might come to power saying that they want to stand for Tamil rights in Sri Lanka, or that they want to stand for Madheshi rights in Nepal, or democracy in the Maldives, and whatever else. Or that government might say that they want to stand up for democracy in Myanmar. And as a result of that, they might get elected. And when they are elected, the new foreign minister might actually start supporting human rights in that country. I think that in any democracy in the world, the majority of people do not want to see people getting slaughtered. This is my humble belief and opinion. I think most Indians would like to see Tamils in India would like to see Tamils in Sri Lanka enjoy human rights. Bengalis in India would like to see Bengalis in Bangladesh enjoy human rights. Biharis in India would like to see Madheshi tribes in Nepal enjoy human rights, because they've got an ethnic and cultural linkage across these borders, across these countries. And so therefore, there is always a political lobby and political impulse fighting for the human rights of these groups in the neighborhood. and eventually around the world as well. You find a lot of millennials in India, especially in Indian cities, actually campaigning and being activists and advocates for human rights in different countries around the world, outside even the neighborhood. And they are going to become a much more powerful, much more vocal lobby in Indian politics in the years to come. 10, 15, 20 years from now, a lot of these people will probably be members of parliament in India. And they might be college activists today and MPs tomorrow. And so therefore, I think that the impulse, the domestic incentive for India to fight for human rights and stand up for human rights is very strong. If a government today stands up for human rights, it is very likely that a government tomorrow or 10 years from now or 15 years from now will also stand up for human rights. And therefore, human rights will become an important and consistent and coherent part of India's foreign policy strategy. And therefore, it is in India's interest to stand up for it today.
Yeah, Zishan, you have rightly pointed out that human rights are really a driver of international relations, and I think it has been the driver of international relations since I think World War First and Second. We have seen that human rights was big concern, and as we see now today, the China and US is having more contentious relations and tension relations only on because of human rights issues. Because China wants that US should not highlight this human rights violation happening in within the Chinese territory. So, in a sense, that human rights are driving the contemporary global order and discourse on issues related to contemporary relations, and therefore India should actively take part in it and should consider it as an important aspect of its foreign policy. Now we have another question which says that don't you think democracy promotion will lead to another dilemma, because the fear of Indian hegemony in neighborhood has been an important factor. So it's creating, like, your suggestion or your value addition to Indian foreign policy may create another kind of dilemma, and that would be a fourth dilemma. So please enlighten us on this.
This is a very good
Please.
question. I've actually answered this question in my book. I've written about this in the South Asia chapter, the Tinderbox. I talk about, reconciling the fact that India, or rather democracy promotion, is in India's interest, but at the same time, in the neighborhood, whenever India has promoted democracy, countries tend to see this as a part of India's hegemony. Um, I answer this question in my book in multiple ways. So, one of them is the fact that you've got to treat the neighborhood differently from the outside world in many ways. And I write about this in my book. I say that it's easier for India to win influence and trust in Nicaragua or New Zealand than it is for India to win influence and trust in its immediate neighborhood. And that is because of the historical clashes and difficulties that we've had, over a period of time. Obviously, there is partition, India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. Illegal immigration from Bangladesh is a big sticking point. With Sri Lanka, we've got the Tamil refugee problem, LTTE, assassination of Rajiv Gandhi. We've got the fishermen dispute as well with Sri Lanka. So there are various issues between India and its neighbors that have resulted in an erosion of trust over a period of several generations and several years. And so what India needs to do in the immediate future is to rebuild trust. And one of the things that India has tended to do with its neighbors is actually treat its neighbors as smaller countries than itself. We leave no opportunity to remind our neighbors that they are smaller than us. We do it all the time. We did it with Nepal very recently. When the Kalapani dispute took place, the Indian Army chief had made a very, very difficult remark, saying that, Nepal is just acting at the behest of China, like as if Nepal is not an independent country with its own foreign policy. So obviously Nepal was offended by this. And the next thing we knew, even though there are very pro-India parties in the Nepalese parliament, the Nepalese parliament had unanimously, with full 100% support, it changed its formal map. So that was an example of a point where India had acted in a politically insensitive manner, really, so to speak, with regards to one of its neighbors. And there is a very long list of examples that I quote and cite in my book. to say that India has acted in a hegemonic manner that has eroded trust in the neighborhood. So the first thing that we've got to do is re-establish trust with our neighbors, reassure them that they are a part of our growth story and we are also a part of their growth story. And I think it's very important for us to stand up for their political interests in the world stage. I think India, in some sense, has got to start representing the interests of its South Asian neighbors. If Sri Lanka has a political interest, speak up for that at the UN. If Bangladesh has a political interest, speak up for that at the UN. Maldives cares very deeply about climate change. We have got to make Maldives an important part of our climate change discourse. Whether it is the International Solar Alliance or whatever else that we're doing, we've got to bring Maldives to the forefront, to the spotlight, to say, look, this is a country that is going to suffer from climate change, cares very deeply about climate change. Listen to what they are saying. So I think India needs to start making its neighbors a central part, and also make its neighbors a partner in its foreign policy at the UN, at the global governance level, and on various multilateral forums. The other thing that I talk about in my book, which I think is very important to remember, is that South Asia is very unique in that democracy is already, sort of progressing in South Asia and has been for several years. I think that the vast majority of people in South Asia would like to have democracy in their countries, whether it is Sri Lanka or Maldives or Myanmar. Look at what's happening in Myanmar today. The military regime in Myanmar is far more unpopular today than it was in the 1980s and 1990s, because the people and you can see that in the proof and evidence for that lies in the number of protests that have been taking place against the military regime in Myanmar. When protests took place against the military regime in Myanmar 30 years ago, they were not quite as vociferous and well populated and strong and sort of popularly supported as they are today. So even in Myanmar today, people would like to see democracy in their country. They would like to see their democracy in the Maldives, in Sri Lanka, and across South Asia. Now, one of the problems that India faces is that it tends to commit U-turns on its support for democracy. So we might say that we support democracy in Myanmar, but we are unwilling to put sanctions on Myanmar. We are unwilling to support a UN resolution that criticizes the military regime in Myanmar. And so as a result, what happens is that people who support democracy in Myanmar, they think that whenever India supports democracy, it is only in order to build hegemony, not in order to support democracy, not in order to promote human rights for them. So there is a trust deficit even between India and democracy activists in these other countries because of these U-turns. So if we start to support popular will and start to support what the people want in these countries, whether or not the government of the day today wants it or not, I think we will start seeing that there is much more trust between Indians and the people of South Asia in the neighborhood.
Yeah, Zishan, very interesting discussion. If there are no questions, then I have two questions. Before putting, like summarizing the discussion, one very serious question and a lighter note take from your book. The serious question is about that you have been like consultant to various governments and you have wider exposure of assisting and working at UN and all things. So if you are like act as an advisor to Indian government, so what kind of toolbox, foreign policy toolbox you would suggest in a 3 or 4 bullet points that the present government should take on? The second question is that you have mentioned about the example, successful example, and the very devastating example of how
I'm sorry, you cut off again. There's a connection problem. I think Dr. Chaudhry's connection has cut off. I'm not sure if he can hear us.
So while he reconnects, can you please answer the first question that he had
Yeah,
asked?
sure. I'll do that. So that's a very interesting question. The first one, Dr. Chaudhry. It's I would say the number one thing that the Indian government should do is promote, protect, and strengthen Indian democracy first. India's multicultural democracy first. We have got to stand up for our
So do you
multicultural
think that
national identity.
is yeah? Can you hear me?
Yeah, I'm sorry, you got cut off. So your second question was not audible. So I was just answering the first question first. Hello, can you hear me? All right, while he reconnects. So, I think India has got to protect its multicultural democracy. There is no negotiation so far as I'm concerned on this. I think without India's multicultural democracy, India cannot become a world power under any circumstances. I'm quite certain about this because with the sort of vast diversity and population that we have got to make every single Indian citizen feel equally Indian. In the absence of that, India is not going to enjoy its political stability or its economic growth that we saw in the last 30 years. And without either of these things, India does not have any standing to become a world power. So that is number one in my mind under all circumstances. The second thing that I would say is we have got to start changing our fence sitting attitude towards international politics. I think India is strong enough now to take a stance on any and every issue in world affairs. There is no reason why India cannot play a more political role, a more relevant role in Africa's civil wars and conflicts, for instance. There's no reason why India cannot stand up for what is right in Syria or in Yemen. And in fact, in many ways, we've got to stand up for what is right in order to prevent conflict before it occurs, so that we do not need to, rush the Indian Air Force to evacuate, hundreds of thousands of Indian people who are stuck in the crossfire in any of these countries. But India tends to come to the table too late. We tend to sit on the fence. We tend not to take a position. Even in Afghanistan, we now find that we are firefighting. So we tend to firefight a lot more than prevent conflicts. We tend to firefight a lot more than try and build peace in a sustainable manner. The third and final point that I would say is that India needs to expand the size of its foreign service. I think that the Indian foreign service being very small, by some estimates, India has as many diplomats as Singapore does. And this is not sustainable because of the fact that India has a very large population abroad. The diaspora has its own consular requirements. And at the same time, Indian diplomats abroad have to also spend time on increasing and expanding Indian influence in the countries where they are posted. What happens quite often in Indian embassies abroad is that one diplomat is quite oftentimes put in charge of multiple issues. And quite often, most of their time, if not all of their time, is occupied in consular affairs, which is sort of saving the lives of Indians trapped abroad. In the case of the Middle East, for instance, a lot of the requests that come into Indian embassies, diplomatic missions in the Middle East, is about trying to transport dead bodies of Indians who have unfortunately died abroad back to India. And this takes up a lot of the consular, efforts and consular work that occupies Indian diplomats. Most of the time, Indian diplomats are thinking about Indians abroad. Very, very rarely are they able to do research on grassroots in these countries to try and understand how India can grow influence in these countries. So the sixth chapter that I write about in my book, I talk about Indian diplomats abroad being tasked with trying to understand the pulse of the people so that they can stand up for popular will and thereby build and grow influence, Indian influence in the countries where they're posted. These things cannot happen unless India's foreign service is expanded several times, and we start to bring in experts into our diplomatic missions abroad. Professor Chaudhry, I did not hear your second question.
Uh, I think he has joined back. Uh, if he has not joined, then let's wind up. So it's been a very fascinating discussion covering a lot of areas, and I think we have through questions and your own remarks and questions and comments by Dr. Chaudhary, we have been able to almost cover all the area issues and perspectives that you cover in your book. So very on behalf of AIRS, I thank you and Dr. Chaudhary and all those who have joined today for the discussion. And we also should thank organizers, the Ariba and others who have put together this event. And I also request people to look for, subscribe to our social media platform accounts and uh, join in future when we are having we have many more events to come in next few weeks and months. So thank you everyone, and good evening to all. Good night.
Thank you very much for having me. I've thoroughly enjoyed this.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you so much.